All right, so triglycerides, really, we can think of these as both dietary fats. So most of the fat that you're going to consume in your diet is really some form of triglyceride. But your body also produces triglycerides to store excess energy. So reminding ourselves, when I do this, we're talking about a triglyceride. Structures of triglycerides, right, are going to have 3 fatty acids. So again, here's 3 fatty acids. This really is a very small chain fatty acid that we have here. Those represent my 3 fingers, right? We can see our glycerol backbone that we have here. So remember, a glycerol backbone, that's going to be my 3 knuckles that we have here. And how I attach my fingers to my knuckles here are with an ester linkage. So again, here we have an ester linkage, remembering that our fatty acid had a carboxylic acid functional group. Our glycerol backbone has an alcohol. It's a triol. Hooking a carboxylic acid and an alcohol generates an ester, and so the linkage that we talk about for triglycerides is really an ester linkage. It's not a linkage like we think about with the polymers that we have in nucleic acids or proteins or carbohydrates, right? But it still is a linkage that we need to think about sort of managing. Okay, so an ester linkage. So important linkage that we have there. What I want us to be able to think about is the cases where we'll talk about making this linkage or breaking this linkage. And in general, this kind of chemistry is going to be the same for any of the linkages that we're talking about. When we make either ester, glycosidic linkage, peptide linkage, or phosphodiester bonds, we are doing condensation chemistry. So condensation chemistry. And in this case, what we're taking is we're taking a carboxylic acid functional group, and that's what we're going to find in our fatty acids, right? So let's say this is going to be for our fatty acids, and we're going to be reacting it with an alcohol. So that's again how we're going to make that, and that comes from our glycerol backbone. So that is essentially what's going to make that glycerol backbone there. When we do this condensation chemistry is because we eliminate a small molecule like water. Go back and look at when we made phosphodiester bonds. We really didn't talk about this chemistry, but when we make peptide bonds or when we make glycosidic bonds, all of those release water. That's why we call them condensation chemistry. And this is how we're going to be hooking our fatty acids onto a glycerol backbone to make our triglyceride. Okay? When we break this linkage, this is going to be hydrolysis chemistry. That's going to be the adding in of water. So it's the opposite of condensation chemistry. Okay? What we're going to see is that is going to require the use of esterases. This is going to be how we think about doing it sort of from a digestive standpoint. Okay? So that's going to take triglycerides, and it's going to at least snip off some of the fatty acids, and that allows them to be uptaken from our GI tract. Okay, highlighting that we cannot get triglycerides out of our digestive tract. So if you've consumed dietary fat, you need to snip off at least one fatty acid before you can get it out of your digestive tract. Another story that we are going to talk about is this hydrolysis. Also happens when we do soap making. Okay, so we'll get to that in just a little bit. Okay, but another story that we sort of talked about in this slide is when we're talking about when we might be making triglycerides. And triglycerides are one of those blood markers. If you go to get a lipid panel, they're probably going to look at your HDL and LDL cholesterol, and they're going to look at your triglyceride levels. And you might be thinking, oh, looking at triglycerides, they're looking at sort of, just, fat stuff. They're talking about, my fat metabolism. Yes and no. Really, when you have elevated triglyceride levels, it is really a hallmark of carbohydrate dysregulation. Okay, and here's why. I hope I've convinced you that glucose in excess is really problematic. It is toxic, and your body has to find ways of getting rid of it. We talked about some of the ways that you can get rid of it. The most natural, healthy way to sort of get rid of it is you use insulin as a way to pull it into your skeletal muscle. It will get pulled into your liver just by itself, but you pull that in and you store it as glycogen. Well, when those reserves are sort of tapped out, then the only other option is to synthesize it into triglycerides in your liver to store in adipose tissue. Okay. We also highlighted that if you really have excess levels for a long period of time, you actually will spill it out into your urine and you will notice it there. But the piece that I want to mention here is after you've sort of filled up your normal healthy glycogen reserves in your muscle and your skeletal muscle and your liver, what's going to happen is you are going to continue to pull glucose into your liver. And then once you've filled up your glycogen reserves, what your liver is going to do with that is convert it into fat, convert it into triglycerides, and then you're going to offload it from your liver and you're going to store it externally in adipose tissue. So I hope I can convince you that when we talk about sort of the correlation and connection between obesity and type 2 diabetes, it's probably, not that obesity leads to type 2 diabetes. What's probably happened is a person was becoming insulin resistant, and their body's only way of dealing with that excess glucose was to convert it into triglycerides and offload it into storage in subcutaneous fat. We'll talk about the different types of fat reserves that you have, but sort of that subcutaneous fat that you have is a healthy place to store excess energy. And I know people don't love thinking about that, but that's what adipose tissue is. It's a bank where you can make deposits of excess energy into and ideally withdraw or draw on those reserves in time of need. So again, adipose tissue, the hope is that you could tap into these, right, as a fuel storage and reserve when you're in time of need. But here is part of the problem that we have here. Remember, what's going to be happening that causes you to have excess levels of blood sugar is you are generally then going to be having high levels of insulin. No matter why you have high levels of glucose, right? Whether you've eaten too much or whatever it happens to be, your insulin is going to remain high. And again, if you're becoming insulin resistant, your insulin levels are going to be even higher. So high levels of insulin are important because they are going to be initiating sort of deposits into your adipose tissue. It's a way of offloading high levels of toxic glucose. You convert it into fat and you put it into the bank. Great. As long as you can tap into in a time of need and access that. Because in a time of need, what you'd want to be able to do is you'd want to be able to take this fuel, want black pen there, you want to be able to take that fuel and break it down into the energy that you need. Here is the problem. When you have high levels of insulin, you are able to make deposits into your adipose tissue, okay? But you are not able to tap in and withdraw. This is a really, really important piece. Insulin allows you to make deposits into your adipose tissue bank, but not allow you to make withdrawals. And so from somebody who is a type 2 diabetic, until you fix your insulin resistance, until you bring your insulin levels down, all that you're going to be able to do is take any excess glucose that you have. Your body is going to be in fat storage mode. It's going to be making deposits, and you are not going to be allowed to make those withdrawals. We talked about 3 ways that you can fix that high insulin resistant state. The first is through diet, right? If you minimize or restrict carbohydrates, you are going to regain some insulin sensitivity, okay? Second to that is trying to maintain healthier blood sugar levels through exercise. Again, that is an insulin independent fashion for pulling glucose into your glucose sinks, which are your skeletal muscles. And the third way is using pharmacological intervention. So metformin is a way to increase your insulin sensitivity, okay? But the key here, and this is a really big thread that we'll continue to talk about, you need to be looking at monitoring your fasting insulin levels, right? You may have a healthy fasting blood sugar level. You may even have a healthy A1C level. right? But that might be because your pancreas is overworking and producing high levels of insulin to make sure that your blood sugar stays normal, to make sure that your A1C stays normal. But if you have elevated levels of fasting insulin, you are trending towards type 2 diabetes, and you need to make sure to get that in check. Okay, so little summary slide here on thinking about triglycerides, particularly as we relate to making or breaking ester linkages, and then thinking about how triglycerides are really a hallmark of glucose dysregulation.